Okay. Over the last few days, there have been armed clashes between the US military and a Iraqi Shia militia in Iraq and Syria, with the US launching airstrikes and missile strikes against Shia positions, these Shia militia positions on the Syrian-Iraqi border, and the Iraqi militia in turn retaliating with strikes upon US bases. At the moment, the situation seems to be just about under control, but there is a danger that the situation could escalate at any time. The United States justifies these attacks by saying that the Iraqi Shia militia in question has been launching drone attacks on US bases and that its strikes were in retaliation to those drone attacks. Now, I ought to say very quickly that I don't know who is responsible for the drone attacks on the US bases, but it seems, or at least it is alleged, that the drones in question are either Iranian-made or at least similar to those which are manufactured by Iran, and that does seem to point to a Shia militia group being involved in these attacks. Whether it is the same militia group that the United States has attacked, I'm not in a position to say. I have no access to the intelligence, and I'm not going to guess. However, there is for me a much bigger and more straightforward moral to this story, and that is this. It is that the United States in Iraq, where it has several thousand troops stationed, cannot any longer trust those who are its nominal allies. Now, consider a few facts about this Shia militia group that the United States has just attacked in its positions along the Syrian-Iraqi border, and which in return has launched attacks on the US bases there. This Shia militia group is in fact part of the Iraqi military. The units that form the Shia militia were formed at the instigation of Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani, the most important Shia cleric in Iraq, and they are in fact part of the Iraqi military, even though they have their own command structure, and were created in response to the rise of ISIS, which for a short period in 2015 looked as if it might threaten Baghdad itself. The United States, of course, returned to Iraq in a big way in order to fight ISIS, or at least that was the justification which it gave. And in the fighting which took place between the United States and ISIS in Iraq and in eastern Syria, the two major forces that cooperated with the United States in those battles were the Iraqi military, composed to a very great extent of these Shia militia forces, and of course, and especially in Syria, the Kurds. Now, these same forces, the Shia militia forces, which were the US's allies in fighting ISIS, are now the people that the US says are launching drone attacks against US bases in Iraq, and which the United States is itself attacking along the border between Iraq and Syria, allegedly in retaliation. Moreover, this same Iraqi militia group recently held a military parade in Iraq in which they showed off their various equipment and were addressed and reviewed by none other than Iraq's Prime Minister, the person who heads the Iraqi government and who is also, of course, the United States' nominal ally in the Middle East, or at least in this duel between the United States and ISIS, which is supposed to exist. So here we have a situation where the United States, in effect, is fighting the armed forces of the state that it is supposed to be protecting from ISIS, and whose prime minister is backing those armed forces in their confrontation with the United States. And of course, if we go back and look at the whole situation in the Middle East, and especially and specifically in Syria and Iraq in the round, we find that this has been a constant and recurring pattern. The United States, of course, invaded Iraq in 2003-4 to overthrow the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. At that point, it found itself in confrontation with various Sunni militia groups in western Iraq. It then turned to the Shia population, and specifically to Ayatollah al-Sistani for support. And that, of course, in turn created the Iraqi militia, or led to the creation of the Iraqi militia, which the United States is now fighting. In response to that, the United States then tilted back towards the Sunnis, and of course that in turn led, after a while, to the rise of ISIS in the deserts of western Iraq. So we have a situation where the United States sometimes shifts between Shia and Sunni in Iraq, but ends up fighting each of them at various times and for different reasons. It can play them off against each other to some extent, but it is increasingly finding that both the Shia and the Sunni in Iraq are coming to see the US forces in Iraq as their adversary, and perhaps the day is delayed when they will make common cause with each other, but for the moment at least, they each seem to be taking shots at the Americans at different times and in different places. The only ally that the United States has, which it can rely upon to any great extent in both Syria and Iraq, are the various Kurdish militia groups, which, by the way, are distinct from each other in Syria and Iraq. But even there, this is very much an alliance of convenience, and these Kurdish militia groups do not, of course, have the same objectives as the United States does. So one has to ask this question. Given that the United States finds itself in a very precarious and difficult position in Iraq, why is it still there? Why can it not simply withdraw, let the Iraqi military sort out the problems of Iraq by itself? ISIS has been essentially crushed, or at least reduced considerably in its effectiveness, and leave Iraq alone, getting those American troops who are currently in Iraq out of trouble, and not risking the all-out war with the Iraqi militia, which is now becoming increasingly possible, in which the Iraqi state would either support the Iraqi militia against the United States, or, which might be worse still, disintegrate entirely, leaving the United States and the region with an even bigger headache. Well, I get to say again, I think the reason is perfectly obvious. It is because the United States insists on remaining in the Middle East as part of some grand geopolitical play. They're not really there to fight ISIS. They're not really there to fight jihadi militias. They are there to try and maintain some kind of control of Iraq, and in order to contain, as they put it, Iran. But look at what the price of that is. We now have fighting between the US military in Iraq and sections of the Iraqi armed forces. We see the Iraqi government becoming increasingly hostile to the US military. And of course, we had a vote some time ago from the Iraqi parliament requiring the United States military to leave Iraq, a vote which the US military for the moment is ignoring. This is not a sustainable position. It's an extremely dangerous attempt to try to control a region which is becoming increasingly uncontrollable, at least by the United States. It is building a castle on a foundation of sand. Sooner or later, this castle will topple because its foundations are unstable. And the sooner people in the United States recognize this fact and pull the troops out of Iraq, the quicker it will be. Now, there is another reason which explains why the United States insists on keeping those troops in Iraq. And of course, it's not just to do with Iran, it's to do with that other neocon obsession, which is Syria. The United States has troops in northeastern Syria, perhaps as many as 900 of them, though one should take all claims about the exact numbers with a massive grain of salt. And it also has a base in a place called Al-Tanj on the Jordanian-Syrian border. Now, those troops in northeast Syria would find their position completely untenable if the United States had to withdraw its troops from Iraq. So the United States, it's keeping its troops in Iraq, where they're becoming increasingly vulnerable to drone attacks and low-level guerrilla activities, in order not just to contain Iran, but in order to pursue some grand strategy of toppling Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, which has already visibly failed. President Assad is in firmer control of Syria than at any time since the protests against him began in 2011. He controls nearly all the major populated centres of Syria, and gradually his zone of control continues to expand as it reaches further into places like Idlib province in northwest Syria. So this, again, is an attempt to prolong a strategy, a grand geopolitical strategy of regime change in Syria, which has already failed. Let me repeat again. There is no logic to keeping these troops in Iraq. Containing Iran is all very well. I'm not sure to what extent it's succeeding. All it is doing at the moment is keeping troops in Iraq, where they are becoming, in effect, targets for Shia militia groups, with the United States always at risk of finding itself plunging into an ever deeper conflict with not just the Shia in Iraq, but with the Iraqi state and with the Iraqi government, and perhaps even with the Iraqi military. So it's not wise from that point of view. And it is not wise either in order to keep a logistics route open to those 900 lonely troops posted in northeast Syria, trying to deny the Syrian government of its oil and grain reserves. That is an attempt to win a war in Syria, which is already lost. It is causing great misery and human suffering in Syria itself, but again, it is exposing American soldiers to mounting risks and risks of real casualties in order to achieve geopolitical objectives which are unachievable. A few weeks ago, I did a series of programs on this channel in which I said that it seemed to me that the Biden-Harris administration was edging towards withdrawing troops from Syria. I still believe ultimately that that is the case. Apparently there were some discussions about this at the Geneva summit between President Biden and President Putin of Russia. I hope that this is done quickly, because the longer those troops stay in northeast Syria and the longer the US troops stay in Iraq itself, the more unstable the situation becomes and the greater the danger to those troops and to the destabilization of Iraq itself. This is a foolish strategy, a strategy that has already failed, and that the sooner it's brought to an end, the better for all sides it will be. Iraq has gone through terrible problems over the last few decades, ever since Saddam Hussein, back in 1980, launched his reckless and foolish war against Iran. The country has never enjoyed peace, but it is nonetheless a country with enormous resources, and enormous resources, by the way, which include considerable human capital. Left to itself, if it can stabilise itself by itself, there is no reason why it shouldn't prosper. Those American troops are not helping, however, to stabilise the country. They are creating instability, and the sooner they go, the better it is for them, for the United States, and for the people of Iraq and the Middle East in general. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You find links under this video. Please check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, ODYSEE, SuperU, and Locals. Please also support us to the extent that you feel you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And last but not least, don't forget to check out our shop. Look up the amazing things and offers that you will find there. Duran shirts, Duran mugs, amazing hats, fantastic sweatshirts, and exceptional hoodies as well. And last but not least, please check your subscription to this channel, and if you like this video, please don't forget to press the like button. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me on future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.